Hashtag the tourist who challenged authority, Part 1. The morning sun cast long shadows across London's busy streets as James Mitchell, a 34-year-old tourist from Columbus, Ohio, stepped out of his budget hotel near Victoria Station. His blue backpack was filled with tourist essentials, a water bottle, a crumpled city map, and his prized possession, the latest iPhone 15 Pro that he bought specially for this trip. The warm summer breeze carried the smell of fresh pastries from nearby cafes, mixing with the typical London scents of exhaust fumes and history. James wasn't your typical first-time tourist. Having traveled to several European countries before, he carried himself with a certain confidence that bordered on arrogance. His perfectly styled hair and designer sunglasses spoke of someone who cared deeply about appearances. Back home, he worked as a mid-level manager at a car dealership, where his colleagues knew him as the office comedian who always pushed boundaries for attention. That morning, James had woken up with a splitting headache. The night before, he'd spent hours at the hotel bar bragging to fellow tourists about his plans to make the most epic London video ever for his small but growing social media following. Several empty pint glasses had littered his table by the time he'd stumbled back to his room well past midnight. Despite the hangover, James was determined to start his sightseeing early. His first stop was a small pub near Westminster, where he convinced himself that a traditional English breakfast and a hair of the dog beer would help him feel better. The pub owner, a kind elderly man named George, raised his eyebrows when James ordered a pint at 9:30 in the morning, but served him anyway. "You heading to see the changing of the guard?" George asked while wiping down the counter. "Yeah, gonna get some awesome footage," James replied, already on his second beer. "My followers are going to love it. I bet I can even make those guards laugh. Everyone says they never smile, but they haven't met me yet." George frowned slightly. "Those guards are trained soldiers, son. Best to respect their duty and keep your distance." But James wasn't listening. His attention was already on his phone, checking his social media notifications and mapping the quickest route to Buckingham Palace. As he walked through St. James's Park, James's mood grew increasingly confident with each step. The beautiful summer day had brought out crowds of tourists, all heading in the same direction. He could hear different languages being spoken around him: French, German, Japanese, and others he couldn't identify. Many carried expensive cameras, but James was proud of his new iPhone, convinced it would help him capture better content than anyone else. The alcohol from his morning beers mixed with the lingering effects of last night's drinking, making him feel invincible. He started practicing what he would say in his video, occasionally drawing curious glances from passing tourists. "Hey guys, it's your boy James here in London, about to show you something you've never seen before." Approaching the palace, James was struck by its grandeur. The magnificent building stretched out before him, its cream-colored walls gleaming in the morning sun. But what really caught his attention were the royal guards in their famous red uniforms and tall bearskin hats, standing perfectly still at their posts. James joined the growing crowd of tourists gathering near the palace gates. Everyone around him seemed content to take photos from behind the barriers, but he found this boring. His slightly blurred vision focused on one particular guard, standing stoically in the summer heat. The guard's expressionless face and rigid posture became, in James's alcohol-addled mind, a personal challenge. Pulling out his iPhone, James started recording himself. "Watch this, guys. I'm going to give you some real entertainment." He spoke loudly enough for nearby tourists to turn and stare. A mother quickly pulled her children away from him, sensing trouble brewing. The morning heat was intensifying, and sweat began to trickle down James's face. His expensive cotton shirt clung to his back, but he didn't care. In his mind, he was about to create the most viral video ever to come out of London. Little did he know that in the next few minutes, his quest for social media fame would lead to consequences beyond his wildest imagination. The stage was set for what would become an international incident, all because one tourist couldn't respect the centuries-old traditions of a foreign nation. As James stepped closer to the barrier, his phone held high, no one in the growing crowd could have predicted the shocking events that were about to unfold. The summer sun climbed higher in the London sky as James Mitchell positioned himself near the palace barriers. His iPhone, held high above the crowd, was already recording what he hoped would be his breakthrough social media moment. The screen showed him standing in front of Buckingham Palace, his face flushed from the morning's drinks and the growing heat. "Come on, guys, let's see if these guards are really as serious as everyone says," James announced to his phone, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. A group of Japanese visitors moved away from him, whispering among themselves. An elderly British couple exchanged worried glances, the husband reaching for his wife's hand. The royal guard that caught James's attention stood perfectly still, his red uniform pristine and his bearskin hat casting a shadow over his expressionless face. The guard was younger than James had expected, probably in his mid-20s, but his stance spoke of years of military discipline. His polished boots gleamed in the sunlight, and his white gloves gripped his ceremonial rifle with unwavering precision. James's first attempts at getting the guard's attention were relatively tame. He waved at the camera, making exaggerated faces while standing behind the barrier. "Look at this guy, followers. He's like a statue, but don't worry, I'll get him to crack." His words slurred slightly as he spoke, the morning beers clouding his judgment more with each passing minute. Other tourists had their phones out too, but they were respectfully taking photos from a distance. James noticed a young girl asking her father why the guard didn't move. "They're protecting the Queen's home, sweetheart," the father explained patiently. "It's their duty to stand guard, and we must respect that." But James had no interest in respect or tradition. As his first attempts failed to provoke a reaction, his behavior became increasingly aggressive. He started making chicken noises, flapping his arms while his phone continued recording. "What's wrong, buddy? Too scared to move?" he taunted, his voice growing louder. A palace security officer in plain clothes observed from a distance, speaking quietly into his radio. More tourists began filming, but they weren't capturing the guard. They were recording James' increasingly erratic behavior. A teenage boy turned to his mother and whispered, "That man's going to get in trouble." James's frustration grew when his antics failed to generate the reaction he wanted. He checked his phone's live stream comments, seeing messages that urged him to stop and others that encouraged him to push further. The mix of alcohol, heat, and audience attention pushed him to escalate his performance. "Maybe he's asleep under that funny hat," James announced to his viewers, now stumbling slightly as he moved closer to the barrier. "Let's wake him up." He started making loud trumpet noises, his face turning red with effort. Some tourists laughed nervously, while others quickly walked away, sensing the situation was becoming dangerous. A street vendor selling water bottles nearby caught James's eye. "Hey, maybe he's thirsty under all that gear." James bought a bottle, his hands shaking with excitement as he handed over the money. The vendor, realizing what might happen, tried to refuse the sale, but James had already grabbed the bottle and turned back toward the guard. The guard remained motionless, but those who looked closely could see his jaw tighten slightly. He was trained for situations like this, having dealt with disrespectful tourists before, but something about James's persistence was different. The guard's eyes, barely visible under his bearskin hat, tracked James's movements with growing concern. Several people in the crowd had now pulled out their phones, sensing an impending incident. A palace tour guide tried to intervene, stepping toward James with an authoritative expression. "Sir, I must ask you to step back and show some respect." But James was beyond listening to reason. His social media live stream had gathered hundreds of viewers, and the comments were flying in. Some urged him to stop, while others egged him on, creating a perfect storm of peer pressure and poor judgment. The water bottle in his hand swayed dangerously as he paced back and forth. The tension in the air was palpable as James moved even closer to the barrier, his face now showing a mix of determination and recklessness. The guard's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his rifle, following years of training for handling threats. What happened next would shock everyone present and change James Mitchell's life forever. Time seemed to slow down as James Mitchell made the decision that would destroy his vacation and the next 5 years of his life. The water bottle dropped from his hand, rolling away across the cobblestones as he stepped over the barrier in one fluid motion. His livestream viewers watched in horror as he crossed the forbidden line that separated tourists from the Queen's Guard. "Watch this, everyone. This will go viral for sure." James slurred, his feet unsteady on the other side of the barrier. The crowd gasped collectively, and several people shouted warnings. A child started crying somewhere in the background, and mothers pulled their children away from the scene. The Royal Guard, whose name was later revealed to be Private William Harrison, remained perfectly still. His training had prepared him for such situations, but in his 4 years of service, no one had ever come this close with such obvious ill intent. Under his stoic expression, his mind raced through the protocols he had memorized during his intensive training. James, now only feet away from Private Harrison, raised his phone higher to get a better angle. "Come on, man, just one smile for my followers," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. The summer heat beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down both men's faces, one moving, one statue still. Two palace security officers in plain clothes were already moving through the crowd, but they were still too far away to prevent what happened next. The tourists' phones recorded every second, their cameras capturing what would soon become international news. James, frustrated by the guards' continued silence, did the unthinkable. His right hand shot out, fast and unexpected, striking Private Harrison's face with an open palm. The sound of the slap echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. Time froze for a split second as everyone processed what had just happened. The reaction was immediate and precisely coordinated. Private Harrison, maintaining his composure even after the assault, pressed a hidden button on his rifle that sent a silent alarm to all palace security. His only visible response was a slight tightening of his jaw, but his eyes never moved from their forward position. Within seconds, armed response units emerged from seemingly nowhere. 2 officers appeared from behind the guard posts, while 3 more rushed from the palace gates. Their movements were swift and practiced, a demonstration of years of training for exactly this type of situation. James, still holding his phone and grinning at his supposed triumph, didn't even see them coming. The first officer tackled him from behind, driving him to the ground with professional precision. The phone flew from his hand, clattering across the cobblestones but still live-streaming everything to his horrified followers. "What the hell?" James shouted as his face pressed against the cold stones. "I was just having some fun. It was just a joke." The officers weren't laughing. They secured his hands behind his back with practiced efficiency, the handcuffs clicking shut with a sound that seemed to echo James's fate. One officer read him his rights while another retrieved his fallen phone, ending the live stream that had captured his monumental mistake. Private Harrison continued his duty, standing perfectly still as if nothing had happened. Only those very close might have noticed the small red mark appearing on his cheek where James's hand had struck. His discipline never wavered. His posture remained perfect, and his eyes stayed fixed ahead, a testament to the incredible training of the Queen's Guard. The crowd watched in stunned silence as James was lifted to his feet. His designer shirt was now dirty and torn, his carefully styled hair disheveled. The reality of his situation began to dawn on his face, replacing his previous smirk with an expression of growing fear. "You don't understand," he began to plead as the officers led him away. "I'm an American citizen. You can't do this to me." But his protests fell on deaf ears as he was quickly escorted to a waiting police vehicle. The entire incident had lasted less than 5 minutes, but its consequences would echo for years. Tourists who witnessed it stood in shocked silence, their phones still recording as James was placed in the police car. Parents held their children closer, using the moment to teach them about respect and consequences. Private Harrison remained at his post, a symbol of unwavering duty and discipline. The red mark on his cheek would fade, but the story of how he maintained his composure in the face of such disrespect would become legendary among future guards in training. The police car carrying James Mitchell sped through London's busy streets, its blue lights flashing but sirens silent. In the back seat, James sat between 2 stern-faced officers, the reality of his situation finally beginning to sink in. His iPhone, now in a clear evidence bag on the front seat, continued to receive notifications from his viral livestream. At Charing Cross Police Station, the booking process began with mechanical efficiency. James's designer watch, wallet, and shoelaces were placed in a plastic container. His fingerprints were taken, and a photographer captured his shocked expression in the mandatory mugshot. The flash of the camera seemed to jolt him out of his daze. "This is all a big misunderstanding," James kept saying to anyone who would listen. "I was just trying to make a funny video. People do this stuff all the time on social media." But the booking officers had heard every excuse imaginable, and they processed him with professional detachment. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, Private William Harrison was finally relieved of his duty by the next guard in the rotation. In a private room inside the palace, he gave his official statement to senior military officers and police investigators. The red mark on his cheek was photographed as evidence, and palace medical staff documented the assault. Private Harrison showed exceptional restraint and upheld the highest standards of the Queen's Guard, his commanding officer noted in the official report. The young guard's discipline would later be commended in a special ceremony, though that was far from his mind at the moment. The videos of the incident spread across social media platforms like wildfire. James' own livestream had been captured and reposted thousands of times. News organizations around the world began picking up the story, their headlines growing more sensational by the hour. American tourist attacks Queen's Guard. Social media stunt goes horribly wrong. Tourist faces years in prison for palace assault. In the police station's holding cell, James was allowed his one phone call. His trembling fingers dialed his parents' number in Ohio. It was early morning there, and his mother's sleepy voice turned to panic as he explained his situation through tears. "Mom, I really messed up," he sobbed, his earlier bravado completely gone. "I need help. They're saying this is really serious." His mother promised to contact their family lawyer immediately, but both knew that a lawyer from Columbus, Ohio, might not be much help in London. The British legal system moved with unexpected speed. Within hours, a duty solicitor arrived to speak with James. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Bennett, reviewed the evidence with growing concern. The live-stream video, dozens of tourist recordings, and the official palace security footage left no room for doubt about what had happened. "Mr. Mitchell," she said gravely, "you need to understand the seriousness of your actions. Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard isn't just a simple battery charge. You've committed an offense against the Crown itself. The palace is a protected site, and the guard you struck was a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces on active duty." James slumped in his chair, his face pale. The holding cell's coffee he'd been drinking grew cold as Ms. Bennett explained the various charges he was facing. Each one seemed worse than the last. Outside the police station, journalists began gathering as word of the arrest spread. Camera crews set up their equipment, hoping to catch a glimpse of the American tourist who had dared to slap a Queen's Guard. Social media channels were flooded with comments, most condemning James's actions and calling for severe punishment. Back in Ohio, James's parents frantically contacted the U.S. Embassy in London. The embassy staff, though polite, made it clear that while they could ensure James's rights were protected, they couldn't intervene in the British legal process. His actions were clearly captured on video, and he had violated serious laws. As evening fell over London, James sat alone in his cell, his designer clothes now wrinkled and stained with sweat. Through the small window, he could hear journalists outside discussing his case. The sounds of their cameras clicking and their voices speculating about his fate made him realize that his quest for social media fame had backfired in the worst possible way. Art 5. The fluorescent lights in the police station's interview room buzzed quietly as Detective Inspector Rachel Thompson prepared her case files. It was now 8 p.m., nearly 12 hours since James Mitchell had slapped the Queen's Guard. The case was being fast-tracked through the system, something that rarely happened except for the most serious or high-profile incidents. James sat across the table, no longer wearing his designer clothes. Instead, he wore a plain gray tracksuit provided by the police station. His earlier cockiness had completely disappeared, replaced by dark circles under his eyes and trembling hands that couldn't hold his water cup steady. "Let me explain exactly what you're facing, Mr. Mitchell," Detective Thompson said, laying out several documents. "The Crown Prosecution Service has already reviewed the evidence. They're charging you with assault on a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, breach of protected site regulations, and disorderly conduct at a royal residence." James's duty solicitor, Ms. Bennett, sat beside him taking careful notes. She had handled many tourist-related incidents before, but none quite like this. The combination of the live-stream evidence, international media attention, and the location of the offense made this case unprecedented. "Your live stream had over 50,000 viewers by the time it ended," Detective Thompson continued, turning her laptop screen to show James the statistics. "The video has now been shared millions of times. The palace is particularly concerned about copycat incidents." In another room of the police station, palace officials met with senior police officers to discuss the case. They wanted to send a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. The Queen's Guards were not tourist attractions. They were highly trained soldiers performing an important duty. James's parents had managed to book emergency flights to London, but they wouldn't arrive until the next morning. Meanwhile, the U.S. Embassy sent a representative named Mark Wilson to observe the proceedings. He sat quietly in the corner of the interview room, his presence both reassuring and somehow making everything feel more serious. "I never meant for any of this to happen," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to make a funny video. I didn't think about him being a real soldier." His words echoed hollowly in the small room, sounding weak even to his own ears. Detective Thompson pulled out more papers. "We've also received this," she said, sliding forward a medical report. "It documents the assault on Private Harrison. While the physical injury was minor, the attack happened while he was performing his duties protecting a royal residence. That makes it an extremely serious offense." Ms. Bennett leaned forward to study the document. "Mr. Mitchell," she said carefully, "I need to be very clear about something. The prosecution has more than enough evidence for a conviction. Our focus now needs to be on damage control and showing genuine remorse." Outside the police station, the media circus had grown. News vans from every major British network lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching into the darkening London sky. American news networks had picked up the story too, and reporters were doing live broadcasts for morning shows back in the States. James's social media accounts, which he couldn't access from custody, were exploding with activity. His follower count had jumped from a few thousand to over 500,000, but not for the reasons he had hoped. People were leaving thousands of angry comments, many calling for harsh punishment. The duty sergeant brought in some sandwiches and coffee, but James couldn't eat. His stomach churned as Ms. Bennett explained that he would appear before magistrates first thing in the morning. The court was making special arrangements to hear his case quickly, which she warned was not usually a good sign. "The prosecution will push for immediate custody," she explained gently. "Given the circumstances and public interest, I think we need to prepare for that possibility. This isn't going to be resolved with a fine or community service." As night fell over London, James was led back to his cell. Through his small window, he could see camera flashes from the media outside. Somewhere in the city, Private Harrison was probably at home with his family, the mark on his cheek already fading. But for James, the marks of this day would last much longer than any physical injury. Westminster Magistrates' Court stood imposing in the early morning light as police vans arrived with their prisoner. James Mitchell, who had barely slept, was led through a side entrance to avoid the massive crowd of journalists and onlookers gathered outside. His parents, having just landed at Heathrow Airport, rushed to reach the courthouse in time for the hearing. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the public gallery, their pencils poised over notepads since electronic devices weren't allowed inside. James's mother gasped quietly when she saw her son being led into the defendant's box. He looked small in his gray tracksuit, nothing like the confident young man who had left Ohio just days ago. "All rise," the court officer announced as District Judge Emma Collins entered the courtroom. The atmosphere grew tense as the proceedings began. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured man named Richard Blake, stood to present the Crown's case. "Your Honor," Blake began, his voice clear and authoritative. "The defendant's actions yesterday represent a serious assault on a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces while on active duty protecting a royal residence. The evidence is overwhelming and includes the defendant's own livestream recording." The court watched in silence as multiple video angles of the incident played on screens. James couldn't bear to look at himself, but he could hear his own drunken voice taunting the guard. His mother quietly wiped tears from her eyes while his father sat stone-faced beside her. Private William Harrison appeared in person to give evidence. He entered the courtroom in full military dress uniform, medals gleaming on his chest. His testimony was brief but powerful, delivered with military precision and professionalism. "I maintained my position as per my training, Your Honor," Harrison stated. "The defendant crossed the barrier despite multiple warning signs and proceeded to assault me. At no point did I break protocol, and I followed all established procedures for such incidents." James's defense solicitor, Ms. Bennett, did her best with a nearly impossible case. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges the seriousness of his actions. He was under the influence of alcohol and caught up in the modern pressure of social media attention. He has expressed genuine remorse and has no previous criminal record." The prosecutor countered immediately. "The defendant's intoxication and desire for social media fame are aggravating factors, not mitigating ones. His actions have been viewed millions of times online, potentially encouraging others to disrespect our institutions and traditions. Judge Collins listened carefully to both sides before addressing James directly. Mr. Mitchell, do you wish to say anything before I consider your sentence? James stood shakily, his voice trembling. Your Honor, I'm truly sorry for what I did. I didn't understand the seriousness of my actions. The guard. Private Harrison was just doing his job, and I treated him like a prop for my entertainment. I'm ashamed of myself. His words echoed in the quiet courtroom. Private Harrison's expression remained neutral, but his commanding officer, sitting in the gallery, nodded slightly at James' admission of wrongdoing. The prosecutor then revealed something that made James' parents exchange worried glances. Your Honor, the palace has taken a particular interest in this case. They wish to send a clear message that such behavior will not be tolerated. The Queen's Guard are not tourist attractions. They are serving military personnel protecting royal residences. Judge Collins took notes throughout the proceedings, her expression giving nothing away. The evidence was clear. Multiple videos from different angles, witness statements from dozens of tourists, palace security footage, and James's own live stream. His guilt wasn't in question. Only the severity of his punishment remained to be decided. As the judge prepared to deliver her decision, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. James stood in the dock, swaying slightly from exhaustion and anxiety. His mother gripped his father's hand tightly. The journalists leaned forward in their seats, ready to rush out with the verdict. The next few minutes would determine not just James' immediate future, but would set a precedent for how similar cases would be handled in the future. The world was watching, and Judge Collins was about to send a message that would echo far beyond this London courtroom. Judge Emma Collins straightened her papers and looked directly at James Mitchell. The courtroom fell so quiet that the traffic noise from outside seemed to fade away completely. This was the moment that would change a tourist's life forever, all because of a few seconds of foolish behavior. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Collins began, her voice firm and clear, this court has viewed extensive evidence of your actions at Buckingham Palace. We have seen your deliberate crossing of security barriers, your persistent harassment of a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, and your ultimate assault on Private Harrison. James stood trembling in the dock, his hands gripping the wooden rail so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mother had her face buried in her hands, unable to watch, while his father sat straight-backed, trying to maintain composure. The fact that you live-streamed your actions shows premeditation and a complete disregard for both law and tradition, the judge continued. Your desire for social media attention led you to treat a trained soldier performing his duties as nothing more than entertainment. This court finds such behavior not just criminal, but deeply disrespectful to our institutions. The journalists' pencils scratched rapidly across their notepads as Judge Collins addressed the wider implications of the case. In recent years, we have seen an increasing number of tourists treating our guards as entertainment props. Today's sentence must send a clear message that this behavior will not be tolerated. James's legs began to shake as the judge reached her decision. The next words would determine his fate. James Mitchell, for the assault on a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, breach of protected site regulations, and disorderly conduct at a royal residence, I sentence you to 5 years in prison. The gallery erupted in gasps. James's mother let out a cry of anguish, while his father wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his own face ashen. The journalists were already rushing from the courtroom to break the news. Additionally, Judge Collins continued over the murmurs. You will be banned from approaching any royal residence in the United Kingdom for life. Your social media accounts used during this incident will be suspended, and you are prohibited from monetizing or benefiting from any content related to this incident. James collapsed into the dock's chair, the reality of 5 years in a British prison crushing down on him. His American citizenship offered no special protection. He would serve his time just like any other prisoner. Outside the courthouse, the news spread rapidly. Television reporters broadcast live updates, their headlines flashing across screens worldwide. American tourist gets 5 years for slapping Queen's Guard. Social media exploded with reactions, most people agreeing that the sentence sent a necessary message. Private Harrison, who had remained for the sentencing, left the courthouse in full military dress. Reporters called out questions, but he maintained his professional composure, offering no comment. His commanding officer later released a statement. This sentence reflects the seriousness of assaulting a serving member of the armed forces. Our guards are not tourist attractions. They are highly trained soldiers performing vital duties. As James was led away to begin his sentence, his parents huddled with their legal team, discussing possible appeals. But they knew the evidence was overwhelming, and the sentence, while harsh, was within legal guidelines. Back at Buckingham Palace, tourists still gathered to watch the guards, but there was a noticeable change in behavior. People stood further back from the barriers, and parents could be heard warning their children about respecting the guards. Tour guides now included James's story in their presentations, using it as a cautionary tale. James's iPhone, the device that had captured his downfall, was logged into evidence. His final live stream had ended abruptly during his arrest, but the video continued to circulate online as a warning about the consequences of disrespecting British traditions. 5 years would pass before James Mitchell would breathe free air again. His quest for social media fame had cost him his freedom, his job, and his reputation. His story would be told countless times, mentioned in tourist guides, and used in legal textbooks as an example of how a few seconds of thoughtless behavior could lead to years of consequences. The sun set over London that evening, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. The Queen's guards continued their ancient duty, standing proud and vigilant. And somewhere in a British prison cell, a former social media enthusiast began the long process of reflecting on how chasing online fame had destroyed his real life.